As a former Marine Corps officer, Vietnam veteran, and philosopher with a focus in social and political theory and ethics, I have spent virtually the last 40 years of my life studying and striving to understand the institution of war and its effect on those who fight it. Now, my ability to shift back and forth from the warrior to the philosopher, to introspect, re-experience, and then to examine, unpack, and analyze, though at times extremely anxiety-provoking, provides a unique perspective, I think, that has been advantageous to my philosophical research and, I dare say, to my healing. Now, in this discussion, I will consider what has been accurately termed, I think, the invisible wounds of war, and three perspectives on healing. The first, what I term the clinical model, is set forth in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which views the invisible wounds of war as mental illness. The second, I term the normal response model, as elucidated by Paula J. Kaplan in her new book, When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home, How All of Us Can Help Veterans, which views a veteran's, in her words, disturbed and lasting emotional response to war as a normal response to an abnormal situation. And finally, I will discuss my take on all of this, what I term the combat injury model, where such injuries and veteran readjustment difficulties are regarded as wounds of war, specifically combat-related psychological, emotional, and moral injuries, PEM injuries. I will begin, however, by providing some background and relate an account of my coming home from war. Although it is a personal story, I think it is relevant, as I am confident that it is not unlike the stories of many others who have shared the experience. I remember thinking, amidst the insanity of the Vietnam War, that one day this horror will end, and I will put these experiences behind me, pick up where I had left off, and go on with my life. Like most young adults, I think, I had expectations of what I wanted to do and to accomplish. Once I returned home, however, it soon became apparent to me that something had changed, or better, that I had changed. I realized that Vietnam had profoundly affected my life, that war takes its toll on body and mind and spirit. I realized as well that America had little tolerance and interest or understanding for its returning warriors. I was called a drug addict and baby killer by many in the general public, and ostracized even by fellow veterans from previous wars for being a crybaby and a loser, for lacking dedication and effort, for disgracing the uniform, ourselves, and the country, for contributing to America's first lost war. This realization that I was alienated and alone, and that no one seemed to understand or care about what I was undergoing, made me sad at first, I think. Soon after, that sadness was replaced by anger and resentment. After several years of isolation and denial, trying to avoid contaminating my friends and family, and avoid the stigma of being a Vietnam veteran, I was convinced by another vet to seek help at the Veterans Administration, the VA. Almost immediately, I was assailed by a VA clinician who diagnosed my inability to cope, my alienation, my nightmares, etc., as a personal inadequacy and weakness, probably due to some pre-existing condition, perhaps a personality disorder, maybe even schizophrenia. Most likely, they hypothesized, my difficulties had something to do with my mother being overweight, or my being toilet trained too early. What was peculiarly absent from all of this analysis and testing, and the ad hominem attacks, however, was any reference to the war. So I blamed myself for my weakness, and my mother for her eating habits and for how she raised me, and resigned myself to the fact that for all intents and purposes, at 25, my life was over. Was I crazy? A baby killer, a crybaby, a coward? Perhaps I was all of these. Needless to say, I wasn't very pleased with myself, with those around me, or with the fact that, other than a heavy regimen of Thorazine, what some refer to as a chemical lobotomy, VA doctors and clinicians weren't offering much in help and guidance. So it became apparent to me that if I was going to salvage what remained of my life, and I was not at all sure any healing was possible, I needed to do it myself, to come to an understanding, perhaps even an acceptance, of what I had done and what I became. Now, after many years of struggle, isolation, and not knowing, of being demeaned by fellow veterans and either being misdiagnosed or not taken seriously by the VA, you can imagine, I think, how vindicated many of us felt when the psychiatric community and its Bible, the DSM, recognized at last that our injuries were not merely a product of our imaginations or the result of personal weakness or cowardice, that they were real and legitimate and caused by our experiences in war, and that our conditions had a collective name, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Further, after years of suffering the deterioration and deaths of so many of our brothers and sisters, this recognition truly felt like a victory, like progress. We thought, or better we hoped, that we would no longer be ignored or misdiagnosed, and that, now that the psychiatric community understood what we were up against, a cure would be forthcoming. And maybe, just maybe, with this realization of war's devastating effects on a generation of American youth, those with a propensity to initiate and support war would think long and hard before sending other children into harm's way. At least this is why many of us initially celebrated the recognition of PTSD and accepted joyfully and with a sense of optimism and relief the diagnosis that we were mentally ill. Over the history of warfare, the invisible wounds of war have been referred to respectively as soldier's heart during Civil War, shell shock during World War I, and battle fatigue and combat exhaustion during World War II. Most recently, the designation has lost somewhat its poetics, been stripped totally of its reference to war and battle, and become rather clinical. People who are psychologically, emotionally, and morally wounded as a result of their combat experience are instead given a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, PTSD, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, is an anxiety disorder that can develop, and I quote, after exposure to a terrifying event or ordeal in which grave physical harm occurred or was threatened, end of quote. Now, consequently, some 30 to 35% of veterans who have served in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan are not combat wounded, but rather they are mentally ill. Now, there are those who dispute the diagnosis and the pathologizing of the experience. In her new book, a recent and important contribution to the literature of war and healing, clinical psychologist and Harvard Kennedy School fellow Paula Kaplan denies that the disturbed and lasting emotional response of military members and veterans to war is mental illness. Rather, she favors a position similar to that of Viktor Frankl, who writes in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that, and I quote, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior, end of quote. Kaplan's concern is that to pathologize these normal responses as, and I quote, a mental illness called post-traumatic stress disorder, rather than recognizing them as a common, ordinary, understandable human response to war's horror, end of quote, is not only inaccurate, but detrimental to veterans' healing, as it increases their alienation, lowers their self-esteem, and damages their self-confidence. Abundant research, she notes, and I quote, shows that social support, not high-powered clinical approaches, but ordinary, compassionate connecting has enormous healing power. End of quote. Consequently, Kaplan advocates what she terms the Listen to a Vet program, and argues that every one of us, even those, preferably those, without professional mental health training, which he refers to as civilians, can help troubled veterans heal merely by listening understandingly, compassionately, and non-judgmentally to their stories and their experiences. Now, to prepare civilians for an encounter with a vet, Kaplan spends the 6th chapter of a book providing guidelines for how each of us can effectively and curatively listen.